Welcome to the Heart of the Stories We Tell, a series where I spend way too much time trying to think about aspects of a story. Today, we're going to go over one part of a story just to get us all up to speed on what I refer to when I say elements of fiction. Today, point of view. So, this is really going to be a weird one. We have a few types of points of view, first, second, and third, and at the same time, they're slightly different over different mediums. So, let's just start with the roll call. First person point of view is I, me, that sort of thing. Second person is you, yours. Third person is he, she, they. It's basically who's telling your story. Is there a narrator? If there is one, is the narrator in the story or above the story? I had a English teacher that used to talk about the fact that people would get poetry all wrong because they would always assume the poet himself was the one doing the speaking instead of a narrator or character. That same teacher also told me something that I will remember to this day, to separate first, second, and third. I am the first person, you are the second person, they are the third person. So let's get started with first person. Anyone who plays a video game has an easy visual in what first person means. First person shooter, right? And I guess now with Hardcore Henry, moviegoers do as well. Maybe we'll talk about that movie later. First person is when the character is the narrator. Harry Dresden is the narrator of the Dresden Files. He's also a great example of an unreliable narrator. That is a concept that most often goes with first person, but not always. The basic idea is, you know what, I think an unreliable narrator is going to be a video in and of itself. For now, we'll just throw up a picture of old Ben Kenobi and his lawyer training at the Jedi Temple and say that, yeah, from a certain point of view, no, you're a friggin' liar. His dad was not killed by Vader. So, let's skip right into what are the pros and cons of first person. Well, first of all, we have the idea of it being easier to get empathy from your audience for your main character. They spend so much time in the brain and in the space of that character that it makes it so that he's your audience surrogate. He's what's bringing you through. Now, that leads to a downside. Something that if your main character isn't extremely charismatic and doesn't have something going for you, it can be stifling. Like you're stuck at a party with that annoying guy. You don't want to be next to the annoying guy. You want to be over there with the fun people. Why do you keep getting stuck in the corner with the annoying person? If it's done well, it can also give logic and motivation to a character, especially one that would otherwise seem evil, immoral, or otherwise not relatable. Remember last week when I said the villain protagonist was going to be revisited? Well, here is where he lives. The villain protagonist, in a first-person point of view, can completely change why you would root for the villain. Now, not always, but there's a good point to be made that that's exactly how Dexter, being told mostly from his point of view, gets to be a little more sympathetic. It's also easier to flesh out a character on the page by allowing the audience to listen to their inner thoughts for an extended period of time. TV and movie used to do it with the voiceover for thought processes. Think of like the old film noir with the private eye. Nowadays, they kind of try to do more show, not tell, which is a good thing, but takes us out of first person a bit. In some ways, a first person narrator is also easier to dump information on the reader. Your main character knows this already. He pulls it up in a split second, but your audience doesn't know it. If Doctor Strange doesn't explain to you how his magic works, then it's just hoobity doobity. So being in a first-person narrative is much easier when his thoughts just come out. Now, the other disadvantages are describing the protagonist clearly is kind of difficult first person. Unless you go with something like, oh, and I looked in the mirror and saw my... Because, point blank, most people don't have a good idea of what they look like. They lie to themselves positive or negative, depending on their self-esteem. And perspective and perceptions are extremely limited, which is why that unreliable narrator lives so much in first person. Because you only see what they see. You don't see the whole story. Second person, I'm not going to be dealing with a lot. That is more like an instruction booklet. I'm sure if you look, you can find some fiction and some stories that are second person, but they're few and far between. The idea of you go do this, you go do that, this is how you do something, is a little harder to put into that perspective. So, third person narrative. Third person is when the narrator isn't in the story itself. It's more objective. Some people even think it's the real view of the story. Like I said, objective. Most movies and video games fit into this trope. Third person point of view is when you look down on high or have just a general outsider point of view. So you can see everything going on, you're not stuck to just one narrator. However, you'll find that some people, like Mr. Martin, do this thing where their third person point of views follow individual characters in individual chapters or segments. At which point, you're kind of getting a bit of the claustrophobia of the first person point of view, but spread out among multiple. With that, let's take a look at comparing and contrasting what the benefits are of each point of view. Again, skipping over second. So in first-person novels, the narrator and viewpoint are essentially the one and the same. Third person can separate those. You can have a narrator that is behind the viewpoint character, one that is different or one that is all-knowing, hence the omniscient. The third-person godlike narrator can be describing the landscape from on high or on far, or a movie director will set the scene with an establishing shot. That establishing shot can never be in first-person point of view, unless you're Superman flying in and looking at the whole scene, I guess. Well, okay, so yeah, in that case it could. They can tell the reader or the viewer something about the character's past in a flashback, or even show you something from the villain's point of view. Just think about James Bond when the villain sets up the death trap then walks out. The camera could follow the villain or it can stay on the hero. That's third person. First person's always going to stay with Bond or whoever your point of view character are. A neutral narrator of a third person setting will be able to home in on where the action takes place and when. So it could even go from telling you about something going on, say, in the north in Winterfell, to the south, to another continent. Now, all of this is just a fancy way of looking at exactly what we've gone for. People say third person's the ultimate storytelling freedom. I disagree. I think that they both have their strengths. The first person point of view gives you the ability to only tell part of the story in such a way that the reader, the watcher, the player has to extrapolate what else is going on. All you see is what your character would see. And in doing so, the rest of the world is going on outside of viewpoint. Using both in moderation is probably your best bet. One of the things that I've been playing with is using multiple first-person narrators. It has a similar effect to the third-person following, but the fact that it's always I, not they, changes the story, especially when people are wrong. Looking from an outside point of view is very different from looking from an inside one. The example I like to give is Batman. There's a story many years ago where Gordon, at the end, looks at something he pulls out of his bat belt and says, "You thought of that ahead of time? You must have been one hell of a Boy Scout." It's a great line, and it's part of the whole mystique Batman's always prepared. But is he really? The story from Batman's point of view can just as easily be, he has 100 things he's prepped. Today, this one comes in handy. And being able to switch back and forth between points of view, Gordon seeing him as always prepared, and Batman seeing it as, well, by luck I have what I need, changes that story drastically. But for now, I think that this has opened up some new thoughts to what we're going to do coming up with other stories. So I'd like to put this down towards the comments. So a lot of that is personal choice. Do you like playing third person or first person? And when you have the ability to toggle back and forth, do you find one being more preferential? What about when you're reading? Do you like being in the character's mind or not? Knowing what they're thinking? I personally always used to love those little yellow thought boxes in comic books that seem to be going away. You know, like the thought bubbles. Whatever happened to the thought bubble? Huh. Oh well. That's another topic. In the meantime, think about different points of views and what they mean, and if a story invoking one point of view shades the way you think about the story. And that'll come up more as we go into individual stories. So, for now, I'd like to thank you for listening to this, and if you'd like, go down into the comments and give us some ideas of feedback, and if not, at least subscribe to hear about next week's, which I believe will be symbolism. In the meantime, thank you for taking this time to explore the heart of the stories we tell.